Well, let's open in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this day. We pray that you will bless our time together today as we look at some of the events and geopolitics and cultural things that are going on in the world today that line up with Bible prophecy. Pray you'll bless our time together in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, I apologize for being a little bit late here. I was trying to process a video, and it always takes longer than I think, especially when I don't start until 11 o'clock to finish up the last one. Well, today, I've talked about this before, that I'm titling it That Sinking Feeling. And I've used a picture of Emmanuel Macron. Now, you might remember that back when Emmanuel Macron was elected in, I think it was 2017, he had a 5-year term, and the election is coming up again this year. And Macron will be, he's facing a lot of opposition. Now, the problem is that the opposition is pretty divided, so we don't know that he's going to be out. But I don't know if you remember, I didn't have time to pull out the videos of his inauguration speech when he was celebrating being elected the first time. If you remember, it took place in front of the pyramid at the Louvre, that glass pyramid, but at the end, near the end of the pyramid, there was this like red light that looked like an eye at the top of the pyramid, right? And it was like right above his head. It could not have been a mistake. Well, following that, The Economist, which is a globalist magazine, it's owned at least in part by the Rothschild family, and they've been globalist and big banking family for a long time. And so, we always say, if you want to know what the elites of the world are thinking, then, go look at The Economist, go watch the World Economic Forum, and that sort of thing. So The Economist came out a number of months after Macron came into office with a picture of Macron walking on water. And it was titled, Europe's Savior. And so now the question is, so Macron's had sort of an up and down career as the politician. And this week, and we'll see some clips later on of him speaking at the European Parliament, because France is in the 6-month rotation to be the head of the European Parliament. And he said some things this week that I think are significant in terms of Bible prophecy. But I photoshopped this up. I thought it was not kind of clever. I thought it was very clever when I did it. Obviously, I wouldn't have put it into my prophecy update about, is he sinking or not? And by the way, that's actually Napoleon's hat that I photoshopped into that. It's sold at auction for 1.25 million euros a few years back at Sotheby's. And then, of course, I have the all-seeing eye there in his hat. So anyway, that's my take on Macron, and I think he's sinking. Now, there's a lot of theories about, well, I'll talk about it when I get to it, but a lot of people think, he's the Antichrist because he comes from Western Europe, and that's where the Antichrist seat is, and so this is the guy we have to watch. And when I see somebody like Macron, I always say, couldn't the Antichrist do better? I mean, really. So he has a background in the banking and that type of thing. So he's one of the European elites, and he thinks the elite. Remember that a couple weeks ago he was saying that he was putting in a mandatory vaccination policy in France, and he was doing it just to tick people off, and it has ticked a lot of people off. So here's some of the channels that we're on. We'll talk about this convergence of events. So much convergence that it's difficult to organize. So here's my grid that I use: acceleration, convergence, logistics, and understanding. As we get closer to the end and the return of the Lord, there will be an acceleration of things happening. There will be a of things that are prophesied in Scripture. And we sort of have a framework here, and we don't talk about each passage each week, so we sort of assume that you have a basic understanding of the different Bible prophecy passages. But these events are going to happen very, very quickly. They're going to accelerate, and they're all going to be happening at the same time. And I think that that's pretty clear that they are. I sat down this week to have a talk with a friend of mine who speaks in Bible prophecy in churches on Bible prophecy and programs and that type of thing. And it's very easy that, we're gonna hold the conversation to 20 minutes. And Pam will say, are you guys still on the phone 2.5 hours later? Because we're talking about the things that we see going on and how they're fitting together in Bible prophecy. And it's just it's impossible to not talk about 18, 25, 45 things that are all happening at the same time. And then there are the logistics of Bible prophecy, and that sort of relates a little bit to this Macron or somebody from Western Europe as the Antichrist, because this will be a power that will dominate the world. The whole world wonders after the beast, and he has military power. So the question is, let's say let's just use the example of him coming from Western Europe. Is Western Europe in the position right now to be a dominating world power? And I think if we're honest about that, we have to say, no way. I mean, Europe is weak, and you'll see that a little bit today. And then, so that's a logistical item. We talk about the Ezekiel 38 and 39 invasion. It says, a great company and a mighty army comes. And so the question is what is surrounding Israel right now a great company and a mighty army? Now, I will acknowledge, and I've said this many times, that the development of drones and missiles, we'll talk a little bit about that today, is asymmetrical warfare, and it allows a company to project way more power than they may have. And that would be true with the missiles in Iran. And I had some conversations with people in Israel about that this week. And then I think as we get closer, we'll have a better understanding. So, Late Great Planet Earth came out 52 years ago now, I think it was. It's sold 40 million copies. It's been very, very influential. And it took the position that the Antichrist would come out of the revived Roman Empire, the European Common Market, the EU. And that's how it was going to go. Now, I personally don't hold to that particular view. I think it comes out of this area around the Middle East. But remember that the Roman Empire covered a lot more territory than Western Europe or Europe. It included a lot of Asia Minor and Asia as well. And that part of the Roman Empire, by the way, survived 1,000 years longer than the European part of the Roman Empire. So if you move it over into this area of Javan, Greece, modern-day Greece, Turkey, Assyria, that type of area, which parts of were under the control of the Roman Empire, then I think you sort of start to piece things together. But that's another talking. But it does say that the wise shall understand in the end, the wise will understand and instruct many. So the question I ask my Bible prophecy friends all the time is, are we at that time where we should be becoming wise to understand what is going on and instructing many? And we're all wrestling with this. It amazes me as I get emails from people, the widely divergent views that people have on Bible prophecy. And it goes from the timing of the rapture to the construction of the final beast empire to the 10 kingdoms to the Antichrist to the false prophet. And there are a lot of different views. So I try to take a little bit broader approach. I certainly have my opinions. But as I always say, make sure your charts and graphs and everything can be edited pretty easily, because you may have to change them in the future based on the way things unfold, because these Bible prophecy passages will unfold in a real world. the one thing I hear all the time from people right now is, I never expected to see this before the Lord returned. Over and over and over again. I didn't think this would happen. And here we are after 2 years of this crazy worldwide lockdown, economic disruption that has changed the world. You know, when this pandemic started 2 years ago, half of the world's assets were owned by 40 people or families. 40. Now it's owned by 10. Now that should be bothersome to people, that there's this concentration of power. Now, there's economic benefits to being close to that. I mean, we talk about the Facebook and Google server farms just down here in New Albany, about 15 minutes away from where I'm standing right now. And this week it was announced that Intel is going to build the largest computer chip factory on the planet over the next few years. They're going to spend $20 billion to build the plant. Well, that's good for the local economy. But again, when you look at and remember that those data farms down there, there's giant buildings that are as long as the Empire State Building is tall, and there's 5 or 6 of them on the Facebook side of the road, and there's going to be probably at least that many. And then you see all these Amazon buildings that are unmarked all over town, server farms. Just drive around; they're all over the place, and I'm not sure why they're all coming here. But in any event, they store data. They store bits and bytes of information on computers, and they have this vast amount of infrastructure. It's just like Bitcoin. We talked a little bit about Kazakhstan recently. Kazakhstan, until recently, was the number 2 Bitcoin mining place on the planet. Now, what's Bitcoin mining? Well, Bitcoin mining is these computers run all the time to do calculations. And Bitcoin mining now, the power used by Bitcoin mining around the world exceeds the power requirements of many countries on the planet. And as it grows, this blockchain grows, the concern is that it will certainly soon be the thing that consumes the most power. And it's just computer calculations. Now, everybody says, well, they'll go green, but I don't know how. I mean, today in Ohio, at least when I walked in here, we were having snow. And, solar panels get covered with snow, and they don't work real well when they're covered with snow because the light can't get through. And this is true of a large portion of the world. So we live at this very disruptive time. Now, I want to start off with this and with some understanding. You may have to find this on Rumble eventually, but this is Bill C-4 that was enacted in Canada back in December. It was enacted unanimously. Think about that. It's been tried over the last several years. And it says an act to amend the criminal code conversion therapy. And you go to the preamble, and here's a blown up copy of the preamble. Listen to what this says. Put this into a biblically informed worldview and see what you get. Think about this. Whereas conversion therapy causes harm to the persons who are subjected to it. Now, listen, conversion therapy is what they're trying to do is you cannot go to someone who has a certain sexual orientation and towards the same sex or multiple sex, I guess any kind of sexual orientation, and try to make them have the orientation, a heterosexual orientation. Attraction. Now, this is interesting because The theory is that when you're born with your sexual orientation, and it's fixed and cannot be changed. It seems insane to me that, however, in the world, the biological sex that you are can be changed or converted to another sex through hormone therapy and physical mutilation. So that kind of conversion is okay. It's to me, it's insanity. So listen to this. And so they've made a decision. This is fixed. Whereas conversion therapy causes harm to the persons who are subjected to it. Whereas conversion therapy causes harm to society because, among other things, it is based on and propagates myths and stereotypes about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, including the myth that heterosexuality, cisgender gender identity, that means you identify with the sex that you're born with, and gender expression that conforms to the sex assigned to a person at birth are to be preferred over other sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. And whereas, in light of those harms, it is important to discourage and denounce the provision of conversion therapy in order to protect the human dignity and equality of all Canadians. Now, therefore, Her Majesty, like she's got a lot of no skeletons in that family's closet, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Commons in Canada enacts as follows, and they have now banned this. You cannot discuss it with anyone. If you do, you're subject to criminal penalties. But you see what they've done with the Word of God. They have turned it into a myth. Now, I think the opposite is true, that they have a myth, and their myth mitheth the point. Okay? John MacArthur preached on this subject last Sunday at his church. Did you hear about this? YouTube took the video of his sermon down. He quoted the Bible, the passages where Jesus identifies the order of creation, which he ought to know about, and took it off YouTube as hate speech. Now, this law is not even in place in the United States. But do you see what's happening? And this is what sort of one of the articles is. This is an article from Public Discourse. And it says, how Marxism won the war of ideas. It's an editorial that was in on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal a week or so ago. And it's cited to this article on the right from Public Discourse, which talks about the problem of atheism. So just listen to what some of this article says. Today, science too often and too easily seems to preclude the hunger for God. But at least modern therapists share something important, their humanity with their patients. Both are creatures of flesh and blood. But the world is changing. Robots with clinical psychology expertise may still sound like a joke, but artificial intelligence alternatives to human therapists no longer belong to the twilight zone, quite the opposite. AI is already used to scan medical records, social media posts, and similar data for mental illness indicators and potential therapies. For the moment, medical experts are duly cautious. The director of psychiatry at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center said AI-driven chatbot therapy may sound exciting, but we are not yet seeing evidence matching marketing. A leading Italian philosopher and cultural critic, Del Nacci, died in 1989, unknown to most English speakers until recently. The first translation of his seminal text, The Problem of Atheism. So he wrote this back in the 80s, but it just was recently translated into English. He predicted the Soviet Union's collapse and the sexual revolution decades in advance with stunning accuracy. He foresaw the failure of Marxism in the East. He also described its ironic triumph in the West in the form of a soft totalitarianism, i.e. a consumer-friendly technocracy of experts. And so this is what Patrick Wood and others and I have been talking about for over a decade now, is this technocratic elite. And there is a great book, I can't remember the author of it. He's a music critic, but he has written on a number of other subjects, including a great book called The Devil's Pleasure Palace, about how critical theory overtook the institutions. Go look it up. It's available on Kindle. I would recommend it. It's not an easy read, but it tracks so well with my own experiences, having grown up in a Christian home. I went to secular high school, but secular high school back in the 1960s and early 70s was not markedly different from the culture. Here's a sidebar story. So my mother grew up in a secular home. They were nominally Christian. My grandfather claimed to be an atheist till the day he died. My mother, they maybe went to church every few years on Easter at a big Presbyterian church. My mother's best friend was a Christian. One day, my grandmother was talking to her and asked her, "Where are you going to college anyway?" She goes, "Well, I'm going down south to this Christian college called Bob Jones." And so my grandmother decided, okay, my mother is going to go to Bob Jones. And that's just it. So here's my mother, unsaved, unchurched, ends up at Bob Jones University at the time in Cleveland, Tennessee. Now that would be culture shock. Uh-oh. Did we just lose power here? Hang on a second here.
Laptop just died?
It's still on.
Because I lost complete signal back here too.
Did you lose my signal?
Yes.
Okay.
It's probably back now. It's on the screen that we look at that. There you go.
Okay, so my mother ends up at Bob Jones. Now, you would think, how does an unsaved person do that? Because Bob Jones is they used to describe themselves as the world's most unusual university. And it was different. I've been there. I spent a weekend there when I was in high school. And it was different. But the culture wasn't that much different back in the 1940s, from secular, unsaved, to what a Christian university was, even a very strict Christian university. By the way, Mom got saved the first or second night there at a revival meeting. So she was able to get by with that. So this Marxism thing has taken over. Scientists have now developed an AI prosecutor in China. That's comforting to know. Glenn Beck has a book out recently, and I know Glenn Beck is Mormon, so you don't need to write to me and tell me that. But I was watching his introductory video on that, and in that introductory video, and he's done this over the last year, he showed that things are changing and you may not realize how they're changing. He had a picture of a friend's Merrill Lynch account. Everything was grayed out. But in that Merrill Lynch account, the person had received an ESG score, environment, social, and governance. And the person's score, and Glenn says he's a fine individual, his score was 4.7, which was very poor. This was Merrill Lynch doing it. looking through his investments and how he lived, and maybe his carbon footprint, what a car he drove, how much gas he bought. So he didn't get a very high score for environmental. And what happens when this is implemented even further? And you know they want to do this. Very troubling. And then you have these lunatic prosecutors, Soros funded, that are changing criminal law. Andy McCarthy, a former prosecutor himself, has a great article at National Review today or yesterday talking about these guys are acting in an unconstitutional manner. I read you the thing that the New York City prosecutor wants to do. And he says, well, we're going to have, we're not going to seek anything over, we're going to charge everybody with misdemeanors. Now, he's tried to walk back what he's doing, but understand that there is a radical change happening in prosecution offices. And prosecutors, here's the deal, they have discretion, but they don't make the law. So they won't charge somebody with armed robbery, they'll charge them with petty theft. So because they don't think they should be sent to prison anyway. They should get treatment. Even though, by the way, they know the people need treatment. Like the guy who stabbed that beautiful young lady to death in Los Angeles a week ago. They're tearing down the system. Let's see. I have Lebanon continues to be, so I'm going to kind of bounce around between culture and that type of thing. So Lebanon continues to be in a sort of a state of meltdown. I saw somebody, I read the Al Akbar newspaper somewhat. It's a pain because you got to translate it from Arabic, and it's a Hezbollah mouthpiece, so it's propaganda. And they were talking about the fact that, guess what? We have, Lebanon's doing better economically. And how do they define better? Well, because the lira has stabilized. So people don't have power. Large portions of Lebanon have no internet. Power comes and goes. But, it's better. So that's good. So we'll talk a little bit more about Soleimani in a moment. And here's another example. They just don't prosecute these tribes. And by the way, last week I said that Union Pacific said that their theft from their containers is up 160%. It's actually up like 540%. Look at the trash, and what they do is they turn the hand. Well, I don't know if I should say they adjust the handbrake on the train car. That sends a signal to the engineer that there's something wrong, so they slow down. When they slow down, then they swarm the train, cut off the locks, and start going through all the boxes and the containers. And they just throw that out. And I saw somebody goes out there and they look, and a lot of these things, they found like coronavirus or Charlie Vector 019 or test kits that were supposed to go to that were in boxes for hospitals. I'm working up some more extended length talks, if that's possible, right, on certain specific subjects. As I was talking to my friend Brandon Holdhouse this week, it's sort of like everything you talk about, you could talk about for 3 or 4 hours. And so here we talk, and I'm not going to talk 3 or 4 hours today, don't get nervous. But algorithms will be our armor in high-tech wars of the future. And there's a battle going on in cyberspace. And as I said, it creates sort of an asymmetrical warfare. And it allows people to punch above their weight class. And look at that headline. This is from the London Times. Soft power in the march of machines as radical redesign creates modern military force. It is something that is very troubling. Very troubling. This is from the Washington Post. Battle to prevent another January 6th features a new weapon, the algorithm. So they're just processing things through algorithms to find out who they're going to prosecute. And this whole investigation thing about this event is that Congress is just going out and subpoenaing people and acting like they're the prosecutor. They're not a prosecutor. They can investigate things related to legislation. But they're just going out willy-nilly. I'm hearing of people getting their bank records that weren't in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, that were not part of the prior administration. They're having their bank and brokerage account records seized, phone records, and they're doing it, and you can't challenge it in court because you don't know about it until it's over, and the court will say, well, can't close the barn door now, sorry. Austria has made state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er compulsory. And if you think things were confusing on Charlie Vector 019er, I don't think you've seen anything yet. It's just going to get worse. And it's going to be very difficult to figure out what's what. In the UK, that's a different thing. We had the president this week give a news conference. This is a graphic from the Washington Post this morning about all the people that are sort of upset, want to talk to Biden. The performance was terrible, but then I watched channels that would support the president. It was like, he is such a wonderful man and president. It's unbelievable how on top of things he is. And it's like, I don't think I live on the same planet. It's crazy. I was on David, if you want an interview where I talked a little bit about it, I was on David Fiorazo's Stand Up for the Truth podcast. You can find the podcast. Just do Stand Up for the Truth. On Thursday, when we got together to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the swearing in of the Obiden regime, and we talked a little bit about this Rasmussen Heartland Institute survey. Now, I'm just going to share with you what the survey found of voters. The percentage of Democrats who support the Biden's mandate for employees, 48%. Now, the other side of the fence is much less. All voters don't support it, but that doesn't stop anything. They just continue to blunder ahead. Democrats who support people being confined to home if they have not received the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er, 59% of Democrats. Now, when you put that out to all voters, 61% of all voters oppose that, fortunately. 79% of Republicans and 71% of unaffiliated voters oppose it. Here's another one. Democrats who support fines or jail for those who have not received the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019 are 48%. It's actually supported, though, by 27% of all voters. So if the goal was to divide society, they've accomplished that. Here's another one. Democrats who support quarantine camps for those who have not received state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019 are 45%. That's opposed by 71% of all voters. But you never see this. Democrats who support passports or tracking, 47%. 66% of all voters are against that. And here's one. Democrats who support removing children from parents who have not received the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019 are 29%. That's troubling. But don't you dare try to prevent or advocate conversion therapy. You can go to jail for that too. I should say this. Some people say, John, you just sound like you have no hope. I know Jesus come back. I had a friend die this week from COVID. He's better off. We'll all miss him. Another pastor showed up here at church last fall, right after Steve Mitchell passed away. We talked for a little while. He gave me his card. We were going to follow up. And he was going to contact me, and he was from San Antonio. He drove up here to come to church. In part because he knew Pastor Steve had passed away. And I saw some posts in a Facebook group I belong to this week, and turns out a year ago yesterday he died of COVID. 2 months after probably 2 months after he was here and we talked. But look, he's better off. All that Bible study that my pastor friend, Bill Randalls had talked about, and what Stephen Armstrong had talked about, they're with the Lord, and it's like they're seeing their hope is realized. Some of us will be martyred. Some of us will be persecuted. Some of us will be raptured out of here. So I have hope. I know where I'm going. But I think we need to know that this is the state of the world that we live in until we're out of here. We have to stand firm in the faith. This article from the London Times this morning. Creepy and explicit, my journey into the metaverse. What are they saying? Metaverse already rife with sexual predators. Is anybody really surprised by that? They always promise this utopia, whether it's through Marxism policies or even people, kingdom now people, dominionists who think they're going to build this perfect universe world, and then the Lord will decide, wow, I want to go back for that. That hasn't happened for 2,000 years, and it's not going to happen. It's a fool's errand. And I think the people who hold that are as dangerous as the people on the left that are trying to build the kingdom of God on earth. So here's what the UK decided to do. Boris Johnson came out and said, we're ending mandated face masks, masks in school, work from home advisories, mandatory passports for nightclubs and events, and a legal requirement to self-isolate. Now they said, look, we think if you're in a group with people that you don't know, you should wear a mask. But we trust you to make a judgment. That's kind of a novel thing. Now people are saying, well, he's just doing that because he's trying to save his skin. And there are major protests around the world about ending mandates today. In Washington, D.C., and Australia, I hear there's a massive protest of truckers underway right now in Canada because they're trying to collapse the supply chain. And part of their narrative is going away. One report I saw this morning is they estimate that 20% of the people on the planet right now have Omicron right now. And I think everybody's going to get it at some point. Some worse than others. Some will die in a car accident sometime, and we don't ban cars. This is from the London Times today. We're demonized as white supremacists for opposing school closures, say U.S. parents. It's probably true. So we have all these things that are going on. Now, I'll talk a little bit about Ukraine. And I don't know what's going to happen with Ukraine. Let's see what this is. Oh, well, anyway, this is high oil price breathes life into U.S. shale, but now the oil price has gone down. So I heard somebody in the Biden administration say, the oil price is down, gas price is down. Yeah, but it's down from like $2.80 or $3 to $2.98. Whereas it used to be $1.98 or $1.65. But so oil prices have gone up, but that's kind of led to a revival of people going out and pumping shale and gas and oil in the United States. The United States oil production is up, supply goes up. Even with demand up, the price goes down. I mean, it's simple economics. So let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. Now, we've often talked about the fact that the Persians, I don't know this historically accurate, the Persians invented chess and the Russians perfected it. And so this is, we always talk about, we're playing checkers while Putin in Iran is playing chess. And here's a graphic I thought was a great editorial cartoon, depicting Biden playing chess while Putin's playing power chess. And it's, I don't know what's going to happen. This is Blinken met with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. This is a picture of their meeting afterwards. So I'm not sure how that went for the United States. Here's a picture of Putin talking about Ukraine a number of years ago. And remember that back in 2014, Russia went in and took over Crimea. And so now, but nobody did anything. That was the second Biden or Obama regime. And now the third one seems that we're going to have a big war over this. And we have to protect the borders. Like we're protecting the borders of the United States right now. It's crazy. So this Ukrainian thing is just, there's a lot of graphics and everything. What's going to happen? I have people convinced that there's going to be nuclear war very soon. I really don't know what's going to happen. Things seem to kind of go up and down. The parties do seem to still be talking, but there's a lot of equipment massed on the borders, both on the Ukrainian and Russian sides. NATO sent some aid into Ukraine, including what they call lethal weapons, but I don't know how that's going to happen. I want to remind you, though, I don't have my graphics from back in 2014. When Putin went into Crimea, there was a report that appeared on a blog, and it was picked up by Investors Business Daily, of all places. Do you remember this that I talked about? That what had happened before Putin invaded Crimea was that a Russian Orthodox icon, see, there's a religious thing behind Putin. Putin believes that the biggest disaster of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he would like to restore that. So understand that this is what drives and motivates him. And there's a heavy religious component behind him. He was very good friends with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now that seems strange, a KGB guy and Solzhenitsyn who spent time in the Gulag. But what Solzhenitsyn really liked was Russian Orthodoxy and Mother Russia. So you have to understand, this is a big thing in Russia. So what Putin did back in 2014, and you can find it in Investors Business Daily online, he took an icon, the Black Madonna, the Lady of Kazan, the most important icon in the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, the original had been lost, but the original, actually, speaking of Napoleon, had actually led the Russian army into battle against Napoleon at Waterloo, where Napoleon met his Waterloo, which was not good for Napoleon. And so this icon has this religious mystique about it, almost a mystical mystique. So this icon, the Lady of Kazan, Kazan, disappeared, and they made a replacement. And Putin took that icon that Russia had finally received back, because what happened to the icon? Well, the replacement icon ended up in Fatima, Portugal. I know this is a very weird, it's a fascinating story to me. And so a number of years ago, the people in Fatima brought that icon, the Black Madonna, the Lady of Kazan, from Fatima and presented it to Pope John Paul II. John Paul II loved that icon. It was of Mary, famous icon in Poland of the Black Madonna. And I have, somewhere on my computer, I have pictures of Pope John Paul II in his private chapel praying to that icon. By the way, when he was buried, his coffin had on it, TT, Mary. What does that mean? Totus tuus, totally yours, Mary. So don't tell me that there's not an issue here with the elevation of Mary beyond what is in Scripture. And then when Putin and John Paul II met late in John Paul II's life, they met at the Vatican, and there sitting on the table between the two of them was this icon of the Black Madonna, the Lady of Kazan. John Paul II wanted to take it himself to Russia and present it to help make peace between Russia and the Catholic world and the Orthodox world. But he died before. They had a huge ceremony at the Vatican, and eventually the icon was taken by a cardinal and presented to Russia, and it was placed in a church. But the word is that before the invasion of Korea, Putin removed that icon from the church, put it on a plane, and flew it around the Crimean Peninsula to bless the invasion. I know this all sounds weird. So anyway, so I don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of mechanized divisions, aircraft. There's some naval people moving on this, and who knows what's going to happen. In the Middle East, Turkey has been having economic problems. And so this week, the United Arab Emirates, who has been historically a bit of at odds with Turkey over a lot of things, they are giving a lifeline to Turkey economically. I think that has potentially some prophetic significance to it, because I think Turkey is a major player in these things. The other thing that happened this week is that the Houthis did a drone attack on the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. And so this is from the National United Arab Emirates publication. They attacked some areas in the port. They attacked at the Abu Dhabi airport. And that is kind of an important thing. Here is I had a graphic of this someplace. Well, if I come to the graphic, I'll show it to you. Also, this week, there's a place where you go and you can kind of find you can find a scorecard that tells you how the Obiden regime is doing on mandates. And I'm kind of got my slides out of order here. Let me grab this one. Well, I'll do this one first. Here's an article in Israel Hayom about the attack on the Emirates. It says this, the title is, the attack on the Emirates, a signal to the U.S. administration. Iran arms the Houthis and conducts itself as the head of a criminal organization whose soldiers do their job. The international community must charge Tehran a price for its deeds. And I did have a conversation with someone in the formerly in the IDF. Has an organization that we hope to be talking to more often. And his concern was that Israel is in a very difficult position. Look, we all think that Israel's going to do okay, but we also have to acknowledge that the prophetic scriptures say that there's trouble ahead. Can we not acknowledge that? And we all hope how this is going to work out, but the concern expressed to me by this individual, I'll identify him later, was that if there's not a war between Israel, Lebanon, Hamas, Gaza in the next couple of years, Israel will be faced with an enemy that has perhaps over 300,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israel. And that it'll be very difficult for Israel to defend against that. So that's a big concern. And then also the concern is when that attack happens, that will invigorate some of the Arab street problems that they have. So you have problems from Hamas in Gaza, you have problems from Hamas in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and others. And so this is going to be a difficult problem. I wanted to go back and mention this. There was another decision on vaccine mandates today, or this week. Back in September, President Biden had put in place a mandate that all federal employees had to receive the state-approved treatment for Charlie vector 019er. And this week, a court in Texas said, well, I'm not making a final decision. So the Supreme Court decision that was made a couple weeks ago, striking down one of the mandates, but letting the other stay in place, the mandates for employers over 100 people. Those cases aren't finished yet, but the court has essentially said, look, we don't think you're going to win, government. You're not going to prevail. So they stayed the enforcement of that mandate. And here's a copy of the decision. The motion is granted as to Executive Order 14043. All the defendants except the president are thus enjoined from implementing or enforcing Executive Order 14043 until this case is resolved on the merits. Now you would think that, well, that's a big case. Everybody's talking about these mandates, right? So I'm sure the New York Times, or as Mark Levin says, the New York Slimes and the Washington Post, it's going to be front page, right? So here's the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so what you see is this little tiny blurb to tell you to go in and look at. Meatloaf got bigger space than the things in the New York Times. So I have well, let's do the elites of the world. Then we'll cover a couple things in the Mideast. So Davos had their big meeting this week, their World Economic Forum. They had to do it virtually, but they're coming back in May with a live one, and everything is online. I didn't have time to go through and edit out the videos. I'll be doing that more in the future, but it was what you would expect. They had a panel on the state-approved treatment for Charlie vector 019er, including our favorite doctor, Fauci, who I forget the title of the book he had on his. He had a book right on the shelf behind him about something about the end of Trump. You know, he was very supportive of the president that he worked for, apparently. But here's a lady speaking at one of the forums at the World Economic Forum, and this kind of gives you the orientation of the people that speak at these forums. You know, we always call them the elites, and if you call them the elites that want to run everything, people say, you can't say that, you're conspiracy theorists. Well, okay, here's what she said.
At Davos a few years ago, the Edelman survey showed us that the good news is the elite across the world trust each other more and more. So we can come together and design and do beautiful things together. The bad news is that in every single country they were polling, the majority of people trusted that elite less. So we can lead, but...
So she's referring to themselves at Davos. She's part of the elites. So here's Macron. So, like I said, I'm not saying that Macron is this coming world leader or anything, but you know, at some point we have to say, if people don't want to be called one of the potentially this coming world leader, then stop acting like it. You know, if the Pope doesn't want to be referred to as the false prophet, then stop acting like we think the false prophet is going to act. And so one of the things that he said, he's elected president of the EU Parliament, or the EU organization. The head of the parliament, by the way, is from Malta, and he's pro-life. And part of the reason that this is kind of an issue is that in his speech at the parliament, and this thing, the speech and you talk about torture, his speech in the question and answer sessions with Macron went on for like 3 hours and 45 minutes. So don't criticize my prophecy update, okay? But anyway, here's what he said. The rule of law is the fruit of our histories, the very right fight of revolutions to free themselves from the grip of totalitarian regimes last century. This is kind of, there's a lot of irony in this. He's talking about totalitarianism when he's a tyrant himself. The rule of law is our treasure, and therefore we must reconvince people everywhere who have moved away from it. This means we must convince them again with a great deal of respect and a spirit of dialogue. With this in mind, I would like us to consolidate our values as Europeans, which are the core of our unity, our pride, and our strength. 20 years ago, the proclamation of our Charter of Fundamental Rights, which established abolition of the death penalty throughout the European Union. I would like us to update the Charter. So we got rid of the death penalty, rah, rah, rah. And so what do we need to do to update the Charter? To be more explicit about environmental protection and recognition of the right to abortion. So that achieved, a lot of applause. And then he also proposed a security pact to make the union more viable, more, to come together better, to have more unity. Lastly, Europe needs to build a collective security order on our continent. Our continent's security requires a strategic reinforcement of our Europe as a power of peace, a balancing power, particularly in its dialogue with Russia. I've been advocating this dialogue for several years. It is not optional, for our history and our geography are stubborn, both for ourselves and for Russia. For security, our continent, which is indivisible, we need this dialogue. We as Europeans must collectively set down our own demands and put ourselves in a position to ensure that they are respected. Frank, demanding dialogue is needed in response to attempted destabilization, interference, and manipulation. In other words, what do I always say? The left and the elites will always accuse you or somebody else of doing what they're actually doing. What we need to build is a European order founded on principles and rules to which we have committed and which we established not against or without Russia, but with Russia 30 years ago. And I want to reaffirm that order here: rejection of the use of force, of threats and coercion, the free choice of states to take part in the organizations, alliances, and security arrangements. So he got a lot of applause, and he talked a little bit about Ukraine. Now, we always talk about the alliance in Ezekiel 38, 39, and Russia, Iran, Turkey, and how are they doing? Well, here is a meeting this week between Putin of Russia and Raisi of Iran. Now, it's kind of interesting, the optics that come out of this meeting, because usually Putin has it, the chairs are together, the flags are there. So a lot of people are reading into this that maybe there's a little bit of tension between Russia and Iran right now over what's going on in Syria. Because you see they have like a 20-foot table, and maybe they're just concerned about, catching Omicron. But I'm sure they're both, in fact, Raisi said everybody in Iran needs to get the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019, and I'm sure Putin has received it. But that's like a 20-foot table. There's no Iranian flag there. And this is kind of unusual. When Naftali Bennett was there recently, they were shaking hands and that type of thing. And this was very different. So it could be Omicron. It could be something else, but they're talking about upgrading their ties. And then in an unusual move, Raisi actually went over to the Russian Duma and spoke to the Russian Parliament, House of Representatives. And he received, on the way in and on the way out, he received a standing ovation. So that's, and I went back and looked. I don't know if this has happened before, that the Iranian leader has come and spoken to the Russian parliament. We also see that Iran and China are strengthening their ties. Khomeini came out and said that the Iranian people need to maintain their religious zeal. He wasn't talking about Christianity, by the way. And then this is on his website. This is Khomeini's website. And you'll see that there is a link here. You can look at it in both Farsi and English. But there is a video linked. Now, he tweeted this video and his Twitter account was taken down. That's unusual that would happen. So what's he talking about when certain revenge? Here's what it says. Soleimani, who has become a martyr, is more dangerous to his enemies than Sardar Soleimani himself. And so it says here, there's an animation, revenge is certain. In fact, reflects the determination to take revenge on those who ordered and carried out the assassination of Soleimani. And so here is, last year they published a poster about revenge. This year they have a video. Now, turn the sound down a little bit because thank you. This is the video from Khomeini's website. So who do you think they're planning on? Do you understand what's going on here? And you can see they go through the whole thing and they eventually take action. So they spent a lot of time on this. So you understand that this is, so even Twitter took this down, but you can see what it's implying. Revenge is certain, they say. So here's 3 stories that I think are kind of important. When diplomacy encourages terror, Naidu's refusal to visit Judea Samaria Jews, and Groundhog Day at the United Nations, starting at the bottom. The UN Human Rights Council came out with another anti-Israel. We got to investigate for how they treat Palestinians. The middle one is the new ambassador to Israel, unlike the prior ambassador, David Friedman, under the Trump administration, the new ambassador has refused to go visit any settlements in Judea and Samaria because this is a continuation of the Obama regime. This is the Obiden regime. And then the question is this dangerous to Israel that the world doesn't talk about the problem, and this is what I talked about with this Israeli general, is the concern that there's anti-Semitism in the world. And it's really running rampant. More about that in just a moment. But here is Israel is preparing, though. They had a very successful test. Here's a video of the successful test that they had of the Arrow 3 missile system. You can see that this is done in a joint operation with the United States and Israel. And they're testing an Arrow 3 missile that will be able to shoot down incoming Iranian missiles. So Israel is working on the capability, and maybe the concern about a few 100,000 missiles aimed at Israel I don't think it's overblown. I think it's a legitimate concern. But know that, Israel is very technologically advanced. They're even talking about using quantum computing to develop these missile systems. This is, as you can see, it's a joint operation of Boeing, United States, a bunch of defense contractors. And they got together the other day, a few days ago, and they tested this missile system. It's called the Arrow, and they were able to successfully shoot down a missile that was tracking like it was a missile incoming from Iran. So here's this is a great article by Jonathan Spire in the Jerusalem Post on Friday. Iranian attacks in Iraq reflect weakness and disarray. So there's a lot of turmoil going on in Iraq, and that sort of reflects that maybe the Iranian regime is not doing that well. But at the same time, the Iranians are projecting a lot of power because of the asymmetrical nature of warfare now, that drones and missiles, which are much, much less expensive to build and make and implement, and you don't have human factor involved except somebody sitting in a control room someplace, it changes the nature of warfare. And so a lot of things have been going on with regard to the second anniversary of the killing of Soleimani and the head of the Iraqi Shiite militias at Baghdad airport back in January of 2020. Here's what Spire concludes his article with. It is difficult to imagine the present confusion, what's going on in Iraq, and disarray taking place under the stewardship of General Soleimani and Muhandis. That's Muhandis there on the left. Their replacements are evidently not of the same caliber as Soleimani and Muhandis. From this point of view, the current impasse of the Iranian position in Iraq and elsewhere is perhaps the most authentic testimony to the skills of these two slain commanders. It is an interesting confirmation of the importance of individual leaders for all of the significance of structures and systems. Finally, of course, from the point of view of Iran's enemies, it is testimony to the correctness of the decision to remove them. It is perhaps unfortunate that the current malaise of Iran's proxy strategy in Iraq is not being exploited by a determined, clear strategy on the part of the U.S. and its allies. Rather, these are at present mainly the passive beneficiaries of Iran's difficulties. In other words, we're not doing anything. There's also a report that there is a secret deal to deliver Israeli gas from the Leviathan field to the people in Lebanon in a way to sort of undermine what Iran is doing by delivering gas to those people so they can survive and can have electricity. And it's said that Washington and Moscow are behind this secret deal now, secret deal. But you can see here what what they're going to do is they're going to take gas from there where around it says Lebanon, that's where the Israeli field is, pipe it down into Egypt, and then it will go through a pipeline down to around Eilat on the Red Sea, and then over into Jordan, up through Syria, and then into Lebanon. Now, I know that everybody wants this to happen, and this will be a game changer and that type of thing, but even all the reports I read said, look, these things are not going to happen overnight. This is going to take several years. Here's the graphic that I was looking for of the Houthi attack on the United Arab Emirates. You can see, and here's the concern, the drones and missiles that they sent from the Houthi-controlled area of, really the Iranian-controlled area of Yemen, across Saudi Arabia and hit Abu Dhabi. The concern is, well, take those lines and move them up the Iranian Peninsula, and the concern is that they're getting close to being able to attack Israel. So this is a Alma Israel graphic of what happened. They attacked an industrial zone. I think 3 or 4 people were killed. They also attacked Abu Dhabi International Airport. This is what some people have the conception of the Houthis, that they're just really using slingshots, but actually they've become much more sophisticated in their attacks, and it's concerning that they're doing that. And we'll have to talk in the future about, the dark green areas are what Hezbollah really controls, and so that's something to kind of keep an eye on. Hezbollah doesn't control the whole thing, but they effectively control the government. Lebanon is very divided. It's a very difficult thing. Here's the article I was mentioning too. Raphael's quantum research changed the face of submarine, aerial, and network warfare. That is being developed in Israel. Pretty impressive stuff, but also concerning at the same time, because it's not just going to be Israel that has it. So this would happen last Shabbat. They were having a service at the synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, outside of Fort Worth. And it turns out the attacker was a British citizen. And here's what the FBI guy on site said initially. Look at what he said.
I do not have any information right now that indicates that this is part of any kind of ongoing threat. We obviously are investigating. We'll continue to investigate the hostage taker. We'll continue to investigate his contacts. Our investigation will have global reach. We have been in contact already with multiple FBI legats to include Tel Aviv and London. We've been working closely with Secure Community Network and the Jewish Federation, and I want to continue to do that, and we will continue to do that throughout the country. We do believe from our engagement with this subject that he was singularly focused on one issue, and it was not specifically related to the Jewish community.
Okay, listen, it's so troubling that the FBI would say this. Now, they've walked back the statement, and they said, yeah, it's probably an act of terror, and he probably was targeting the Jewish synagogue. But here's what's happened, is that the FBI's ability, unfortunately, has been hollowed out. What do I mean? Well, remember I showed you the 2019 FBI terrorism report that focused on homegrown Islamic extremism. Now, this guy came from Great Britain, and how did he get into the United States anyway? That also should be troubling. And then go buy a gun to do this attack. And he said that he was attacking Jews. He wanted to attack the synagogue. He wanted to get this Islamic terrorist released, who, by the way, across the world, people have been trying to get this Pakistani woman who's a terrorist released from U.S. prison. She's held in a prison near Fort Worth. 57 people have died in those attacks, those terrorist attacks, to try to get her released from prison. So this is part of a bigger plot. And it's just troubling that the FBI says, well, we don't really think he just acted, he's a lone wolf. But then they take that same terror pictures and everything in that 2019 report, and then last summer they tweeted out and say, we have to go after our own homegrown terrorists, right-wing extremists. And now they're going after parents that complain at at school board meetings. So here's Caroline Glick article in Israel Helm the other day. She just said that we have a problem, and the U.S. has the same problem. You have unelected lawyers and judges causing problems in society and culture. Now, there are reports that Netanyahu is very close to a plea deal, which will require him to leave office, not run for office for at least 7 years, I hear. A 7-year agreement. That's kind of interesting. But it doesn't mean anything. I'm just trying to make a little bit of a... I guess eschatological jokes don't really go over that well, do they? So the Jerusalem Post, which I like to read, it's a good newspaper, great newspaper in many respects. There's articles in there like, Netanyahu, just go away. And I think people are tired of Netanyahu. But the bigger picture is that I think the charges were all trumped up. They were ridiculous. And the same thing is happening with the former president in the United States. They're going after him on all these things. And eventually you just wear the person down. And so here's Yaakov Katz, who's the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He just says, given the choice, let's go for the plea deal. Netanyahu, just take the deal and get out of our lives. And it's fine that he holds that opinion, but what's the bigger picture? Because it won't stop with Netanyahu. Everybody acts like that's just a one-off. No, this has been going on in Israeli society for a while. They just got the big fish this time. And the same thing is happening here. And you're just going to hear it. I'm telling you, between now and the next election, if Trump decides to run, you're going to hear about investigation after investigation after investigation. It will be a never-ending thing. And lunatic sycophants like Liz Cheney and stuff will go right along with it. It's very disgusting. And so the question is, what does this really mean? Okay, I'm going to jump into this. I would recommend you go get Caroline Glick's podcast, download it. She does it every week. It usually comes out on Thursday or Friday. So she's talking with Lee Smith and Gavi, her usual partner, about what's going on with this. What do we do about this? Is this a big deal? And I want you to hear her conclusion. So I'm going to jump into the middle of this, but they're discussing what is going on with this prosecution of Netanyahu, and should we be concerned about it, and what does it really mean? And you need to understand, you have to extrapolate it to what's going on in our country, because there seems to be a connection. So here we go.
What's going to happen, I don't have a crystal ball, but when you look at the level of sentiment, of anger, of rage that Netanyahu's 2 million supporters feel at what's happened, I think we're going to see much more of a disarray in our politics than we've experienced even with our 4 successive elections. What is its situation? How would you describe the parallel situation in the United States between the right and the left, conservatives and progressives in the Biden administration?
Well, the Biden administration, there have been, we've seen even CNN reporters backing off the Biden administration because it's a sinking ship. I think one of the important things that I'll describe here very quickly, and I think there are probably similarities to the Israeli political scene. But the way that I've understood it is what we're looking at a elite on the way out, right? The problem is you hear a lot of commentary on the right, and they're worried about the future of the United States. They're worried about the way America, and understandably, that things are not good right now. But the way that I understand this is America is still a strong country, still have people who love this country, who will sacrifice enormously for this country. The problem is the argument that I've made again, it's not the end of America, it's the end of this particular American elite. So it's a transition. And look, if you if you look at Joe Biden, I mean, people have compared Biden to the Andropov years of the, to Andropov himself in the Soviet Union. This man is a mummy. I mean, he barely exists as a, he's a mummy with an algorithm. And in that way, it's charming and funny to see what our AI geniuses can do. But insofar as this man is a real president managing the country, obviously not. And of course, it's very dangerous, because who are the people who are behind him pushing all sorts of various interests with Biden as a screen? All right, so it's a very dangerous moment here. But the reason, again, I'm optimistic about what's happening here is that we're seeing the end of a particular branch of the American elite. And I've heard, I'll leave it up to you guys, but I mean, my question is, I know that this has been a political conflict within Israel for decades. There is one elite, there's an Ashkenazi elite, but there's lots of other people in the country. So I'm interested to hear if there's if this elite is on its way out, or if it's feeling its oats now that it's appears to have thrust Benjamin Netanyahu out of the political arena forever.
I think that it had a big price. As Erel Segal here, a very interesting pundit here, commented. He said that this judicial oligarchy that went after Netanyahu went one bridge too far. And he said, when you try to hunt down Moby Dick, your own ship is in danger of sinking. And what happened with the Netanyahu trial is that it exposed them. It exposed their illegal methods. It exposed the way that they are trying to string together a ridiculous indictment. It's really, in judicial matters, it's ridiculous. And it also exposed, which for me is one of the most interesting things, it exposed the press. Because as I see it here, and it connects to the...
So he's optimistic, but here it goes on. Here, let me move forward a little bit.
Abandoning Israel's sovereignty in the Negev, which is 40% of the territory of the country, to the Muslim Brotherhood. And, and a whole host of other
She's
things
not
are
optimistic,
just
by the way.
sacrificing the Jewish identity of this country to the various radicals in the governing faction, in the governing coalition. And in the United States, you see, progressives who are literally going to war against the American people, against American history, against American parents, against American children, against American health system, and so on and so forth. And so the question is, how do you get rid of an elite when the people themselves, who are not part of the ruling class, are so polarized or so divided?
I would say Israel has a big advantage over the United States in this one canon. But it doesn't have to do with. It's a proudly nationalist state, as are many Americans still, regardless of what our progressive elite says. The advantage that Israel has is that Israel has the Bible. By which I mean it's not just that values come from the Bible but the Bible is also a story. It's a history that explains what happens throughout history, right? And what is the story that keeps happening? The problems of the Jewish people, right? The problems with their leadership, the problems, what they turn from and what they turn to. So I think, and of course for many Americans, especially evangelicals, and who understand our own experience on the basis of what Israel has gone through for thousands of years, I think those people have a huge advantage over those of us who see, look, American history is still really short. I mean, we're the oldest democracy in the world, but not even 250 years old yet. So what are the different changes? What are the different transitions that we'll go through? And I think we're seeing a profoundly transitional time now. But does it mean that American history is coming to an end? No. And I don't think it means that that Israel as a Jewish state, is either, of course, it's coming it's coming under threat. But again, that's why the Bible is valuable. We see this. It's a history of how people fight for their beliefs. Hey, don't you understand? You turn from God. Here's what happens. The prophets are screaming again. Here's what's going on. So that's how I think that Israel has an advantage over many Americans who are concerned about where our country is going right now. And yet there are other Americans who do see it like that.
I gave a lecture to a group of pre-army aged kids who are in a leadership school last week, and we had just read in the Torah portion of the week about Moses getting the eve of leaving Egypt, going out of the Exodus, and Rabbi Sachs, the recently departed chief rabbi of Britain, wrote a beautiful piece about it where he was explaining that, Moses said to the children of Israel 3 times, the night that they're leaving, the most unbelievable event that, in human history, right, where God is taking a nation of slaves out of the global superpower and destroying the global superpower. And this is something that's nuts. And so instead of living that moment, 3 times during the portion of the Torah that we read that week, Moses says to them, and you will tell your children, and you will tell your children, and you will tell your children. And it's all about turning this into history. What does it mean? What will it mean through the ages? And so Rabbi Sachs explained that the United States and Israel are these 2 countries that created themselves, these 2 nations that created themselves by acts of will that were sort of against the laws of nature. And their survival depends on the retelling of their story. And that's why, for instance, the 1619 Project is so disastrous, because if you have a generation of Americans, or for that matter, of Jews, who have no idea what their story is, and they're not going to retell it, and then the nations will disappear. And so, I think that is an existential threat. I think the lack of history, the revision of Jewish history, the revision of American history, by these progressives is an existential threat, specifically to these 2 self-defined nations, self-created nations.
What we're watching, right?
So, very interesting comments, don't you think? Listen, what I took away from what Caroline had to say, and I think I see the progression of this, and I see God intervening again with a global superpower. But God will intervene. But what I'm hearing from her, I think, and I don't think I'm overstating it, is a recognition that this is really a spiritual battle that we are in. It's the politics and everything. Yeah, there's politics and control and that type of thing. But when you really get to the core of it, it is a spiritual battle. That's why this book about Marxism and critical theory was titled The Devil's Pleasure Palace, because it will all seem so good. So what we have to do is tell people the truth and tell them what's coming and how this is unfolding. And it may be that there's a respite. It may be, the analogy of scripture and prophecy is that these things are birth pangs. So what happens, I haven't had a baby, but I've read about it, and so birth pangs come on and they're really intense, and then they kind of calm down for a little bit. And then they come back more intense and more intense and more intense. But there's periods of relief in there until you get right up at the end when everything converges and accelerates very quickly. So that's kind of where we are. Are we in a respite period, or is we got another birth contraction coming? That's the question. I think it's more likely that we have birth contraction coming, because as narratives collapse around the world about Charlie Vector and how to treat it, and people are upset, what are the elites going to do? They're going to just walk away and say, "Oh, okay." I said on David Fiorazo the other day that my concern is that, as in the United States, that the party that claims to be for voting rights, they didn't get their legislation, did they? So now the states are going to control elections just like the Constitution says, but their narrative has collapsed. Their ability to interfere in that process and control it at the federal level has collapsed. And they know that people are really upset and are motivated to vote against them. What do you do? What my concern? I think they'll say, hey, if you don't have the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er, no vote for you. Because that will get rid of enough percentage of voters, allow them to maintain their power. I think it may be coming. I don't know. I'm not a prophet. But I'm just saying is these things, it's a turbulent world. And I think, what's the old saying? Normal isn't coming back, but Jesus is. And that's what we need to focus on. So let's pray. Remember, share the gospel with people. Tell them about what Jesus did on the cross. He lived a perfect life, was crucified for our sins, buried, rose again on the third day, returned to heaven, and he's coming back to set up his kingdom. And that ought to be a message that we give, and it ought to be a message that gives us great hope. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you so much for the opportunity that we have, the blessing that we have to live at this time of human history. Pray that you will help us to be wise, motivated, act like men, stand firm in the faith, armed with the whole armor of God. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.